in the death of President John Kennedy. I'd like to now have, let's see, the first slide.
And you have it right down there.
I guess you can all see that. I was chairman of the Forensic Pathology Committee of the reinvestigation in 1977 of the death of President Kennedy. There were 9 chief medical examiners from around the country on that. Some of you will recognize people from your area. There was the last 2 living people just recently died. Dr. Wecht and Dr. Spitz have recently died.
You're living.
I'm still alive. But you'll recognize Joe Davis was on it from Miami, and people from around other important areas. And we all agreed, firstly, that the autopsy was not properly done. And the reason it wasn't done is because you can see Dr. Rose was the medical examiner in Dallas when the death occurred. He had done hundreds of autopsies in Dallas on rifle gunshot wounds. The body was illegally moved from the place of death, which is where the medical examiner is supposed to take charge, to Bethesda Hospital in Washington, where the person doing the autopsy, Dr. Humes, was an excellent hospital pathologist, but had never done a gunshot wound death before. The reason for that in our investigation seemed to be because there was an issue during the election as to whether or not President Kennedy had Addison's disease and should therefore not be voted for president. Bobby Kennedy strongly came out and said he didn't have Addison's disease, which is a disease of the adrenal gland that interferes with the body's manufacture of steroids, of cortisone and other steroids. And from our investigation, it appears because of that, the family wanted to make sure that the autopsy was done where there was more control over it, and the autopsy never revealed the state of the adrenal glands. And when we investigated this later on, Dr. Humes said that it was diseased, as had been the question raised, and that change of venue from Dallas forensic pathologist to a hospital pathologist in Bethesda has resulted in, after 51 years, still controversy as to President Kennedy's cause of death. As I will show you in the slides, here is President Kennedy just before he was shot, and there's a brutal film. Jackie Kennedy to his left, Governor Connolly lower down in front of him. As they go past the street sign, as many of you know, was when the second gunshot is fired. There were 3 shots fired by Oswald, and the first misses and hits a curb, never recovered outside. When the second shot is fired while he's going behind this screen, President Kennedy is seen leaning forward. He has been shot in the back, upper back. The bullet has gone through him, through his neck, into the back, the right side of the back of Governor Connolly in front of him. His right arm goes into Connolly's back, exits on the right side near the nipple of the chest, goes through the wrist of Governor Connolly and into his left thigh, where it is, and is recovered in the Parkland emergency room on his stretcher. This is an X-ray of the bullet going through Governor Connolly's wrist. It's the only bone that was struck. Went through President Kennedy without hitting a bone, went through Connolly's chest, only struck this, and you can see the little fragments of the bullet present, very minor, and that's where the so-called magic bullet came out. How can a bullet go through two people without more deformities? Because the only bullet that, the only bone that it struck was a thin bone, the radius on Connolly's wrist. The first bullet that struck Kennedy struck him in the upper chest. These are, you'll see, are diagrams done under my supervision in the commission, exactly showing what the photographs show. This is approved at the time of the autopsy, because the family didn't wish to have actual photographs, and they have a right, photographs to be shown. They're in the National Archives, but these are exactly what the photographs, the autopsy photographs show. And the bullet goes through the upper back, through his neck. This exits the upper neck. And the reason we see it that way is the only person to see the actual bullet was Dr. Perry, who was a chief resident in the emergency room there, who did, the first thing he did was to make an incision to put an air passage, a tracheostomy, through it. And in the lower photograph, in the lower drawing, you can see that at 6 o'clock there's a semicircle. That semicircle is part of the exit wound. Now, Dr. Perry assumed the bullet was, a hole was an entrance wound. He said at that time to the press that he was shot once in the neck, in addition to the head, the bullet that struck the head, which is seen right afterwards. When the body is brought up to Bethesda, the Bethesda autopsy doctors didn't contact the emergency room doctors to find out what incisions they made and what it looked like. That's always part of the forensic pathologist's information, is that when a body, when a sick person, an injured person comes into the emergency room, things are going to be done. Injections into the blood drawing from the veins, incisions to let out air from the chest cavity, and we can't tell from the autopsy alone necessarily whether that was done by the doctor or by the bad guy. So here was an exit wound that was presented to the doctors in Bethesda, who didn't realize there was a bullet hole there. They turned the body over and saw the bullet entrance in the back. They saw the one in the back, which the doctors in Dallas hadn't seen, and couldn't figure out what happened to that bullet because they didn't recognize the neck as being an exit wound. They just thought it was the usual incision that was made in those days to put in an air passage. And so they told the press here he was shot once in the back. They, in the normal course of the discussion present in the National Archives, the doctors who did the autopsy said, well, we couldn't find the bullet, it must have dropped out. In their statements to the FBI and other people, there were a lot of people in that autopsy room that shouldn't be there normally, they assumed, first autopsy they had done, the bullet entered, they couldn't find an exit, therefore the bullet must have came back out while the body was on its back on the autopsy table. So here is a diagram of how it happened. On the left is the bullet enters the upper back and goes through the neck in the way that the president's head is bent, coming from where Oswald was sitting in the Texas Book Depository building, and then goes into the back of Governor Connolly. This is the magic bullet. It looks good and intact here, but when one sees that bullet and handles it, it doesn't roll over because the other side is flat, where it's lost a few it was flattened out and it lost a few milligrams of weight on the way out. It doesn't roll, but it's not magic. It's damaged, but it looks pretty good. Now, the third bullet strike is, see, Connolly is still moving, and while Jackie Kennedy's holding the president, the fatal bullet, he may very well have recovered from the first bullet because it didn't strike any vital organ. But here you could see after the headshot there is extravasation of the temporal bone on the right side of President Kennedy's head through a large gaping exit perforation. However, the entrance perforation is just a small perforation in the back of the head, which is typical for a rifle entry wound. This has been confused with people saying, with the release of papers and the people, witnesses allegedly, the funeral director people and other people who saw the president after he had was in the emergency room and came out, because that perforation had caused a lot of bleeding as he was lying on his back. So the photographs that people say they saw is a lot of blood around the hair, but the bullet hole was only seen in during the autopsy when all the blood was removed and the head carefully washed, and it's just a small typical entrance wound through the head. And this was the appearance. This is the way the fatal gun headshot occurred. The three fragments, skull fragments seen above the skull were recovered from various places and do match the perforation and the exit, the entrance in the back of the head and the exit on the right frontal area of of President Kennedy's head. So this describes there's still some new Kennedy materials that should be released. With all the release of all the information thus far, this description before you of the entrance wound, you could see in the lower, just to the right of the spinal column on the right, that's the entrance in the upper back, and the exit of the bullet that goes through the neck into Governor Connolly, and then the second shot that strikes him is in the upper head, where there's a black dot, and exits toward the right of his head. And the fragments, those bullet fragments, two fragments were recovered from the front seat of the president's vehicle. Now, that, I'm sure there are people out there that I can't see who may disagree with that. We will have time to discuss it, but
Can I ask you one question? You said somebody had never done an autopsy. Could you explain that? Where the body went, they never done a gunshot autopsy? When he was taken from Dallas to Bethesda, was it?
Yeah.
They had never done a gunshot autopsy?
Yeah, the doctors doing the autopsy, and we interviewed them, part of our commission. We interviewed every doctor that was connected to the autopsy. It was Dr. Humes was the main one. No, they were hospital doctors at Bethesda. None of them had performed an autopsy on a gunshot victim, because even in Washington, D.C., if there's a shooting, that goes to the medical examiner, the coroner. Hospital pathologists are not trained to do unnatural death autopsies or issue death certificates. Death certificates in natural deaths, cancer, heart disease, etc., can be issued by doctors, or any doctor treating a patient can do that, including pathologists. But if somebody dies of accident, suicide, or homicide, the coroner or the medical examiner has to investigate and issue that death certificate. Dr. Humes, and he said to us when we interrogated him under oath in Washington, D.C., and the other doctor said no, they had never done an autopsy in D.C., in Bethesda, or overseas, on a gunshot victim, and that led to their failure to get more information about entrance and exit wounds, and to the current issues that have come up. And one of those current issues also has to do with what happened to the brain. The brain disappeared after the autopsies, and Dr. Wecht was the first one to really raise that issue, was that at some point after President Kennedy's death, and after when John F. Kennedy died, his steamer's trunk that his secretary, Miss Lincoln, had taken care of, was opened up because it contained all the findings of President Kennedy. It was thought that the brain had been kept in the steamer trunk, but it wasn't there. And the whole issue of the missing brain came up. We found out later, I found out after the release of the reports and all from our commission, that at the time that the President Kennedy's casket was removed from the temporary location, Arlington Cemetery, and was placed in its permanent place in Arlington Cemetery, there was a midnight meeting of some of the family members, the Kennedy family members, and a couple of lawyers at the time of the changing of the placement into the permanent gravesite, at which time Bobby Kennedy had brought the brain and all other tissues that were taken at autopsy, the microscopic slides, the paraffin blocks, the tissues that are kept in formaldehyde for further examination, were all missing from the steamer chest, and apparently as part of a personal or religious feeling, placed them in the gravesite at the time that the body was reinterred, and where they are today. But that was one of the problems, was that Dr. Humes did not further examine the brain after the autopsy because there were issues of whether there could have been more than one gunshot wound that was raised, and it would normally have been examined.